I reported my own son to the FBI. The call I made from my kitchen table in Portland, Oregon on a gray October morning destroyed our family, cost him his freedom, and saved 34 cancer patients from losing everything they had left to give. I'd make the same call again. My name is Robert Hale. I'm 63 years old. For 31 years, I taught high school physics in Portland, the kind of teacher who stayed late, who remembered students' names 5 years after graduation, who genuinely believed that if you could help a young person understand how the world worked, you'd given them something no one could ever take away. Margaret used to say I was better at explaining the universe than explaining myself. She wasn't wrong. Margaret, my wife of 34 years. She passed away 4 years ago from pancreatic cancer. Fast and merciless. That's the only way to describe it. 7 months from diagnosis to the end. 7 months of treatments and hope and setbacks and more hope, and then a Tuesday morning in February when I held her hand and she simply stopped being in the world. After she was gone, I retired. Sold some things, kept others. Learned how to make coffee the way she liked it, even though she wasn't there to drink it anymore. Grief is strange that way. You keep performing the rituals of a life that no longer exists, because stopping feels like losing the person all over again. My son Daniel and I drifted in those 4 years. Not dramatically. No arguments, no slammed doors, no declarations. Just the slow, quiet accumulation of distance that happens when the person who connected two people is no longer there to do the connecting. Margaret had been our bridge. She spoke Daniel's language in ways I never quite managed. She knew when he needed space and when he needed to be pulled in. Without her, Daniel and I were two men who shared DNA, shared history, and had somehow, without meaning to, become strangers who texted each other on birthdays. He was building his financial planning practice in Seattle. I was in Portland trying to figure out who Robert Hale was when he wasn't a husband or a teacher anymore. So when my phone rang that Tuesday in October and Daniel's name appeared on the screen, I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me answer. Dad. His voice had that particular brightness I'd learned to recognize over the years. The brightness that isn't quite natural. The kind that gets applied over something else the way fresh paint gets applied over a wall with problems. Claire and I want you to come for dinner this Saturday. It's been too long. 4 months, I thought. 4 months and 11 days, if I was being precise. Not that I was counting. What's the occasion? I asked. Does there need to be one? He laughed. The laugh landed a little wrong, too. Come on, Dad. Drive up Saturday. Stay the night. Claire's making that salmon you like. The cedar plank one with the maple glaze. Claire was Daniel's wife of 6 years. She was 34, worked as a dental hygienist at a practice in Bellevue, and had never once in 6 years of marriage called me anything but Robert. I understood it. I wasn't her father. But Margaret, in the warm and effortless way she had been called Mom by Claire within the first year. Some gaps, once opened, don't close on their own. What time? I said. 6:30. And Dad, bring your appetite. After he hung up, I sat in my armchair and looked out at the October rain. Portland in October is all low clouds and drizzle, the kind of gray that settles in for months and somehow still catches you by surprise every year. Margaret would have known immediately what this was about. She would have heard that slight performance in Daniel's voice and known what it meant. She would have made me a cup of tea, sat across from me, and said something like, Go, Robert. Whatever it is, just go. He's still your boy. I went. The drive from Portland to Seattle takes about 3 hours, depending on traffic, longer on weekends. I left early enough to miss the worst of it. I stopped at a wine shop in Olympia and spent 20 minutes with a young man who was far too enthusiastic about Willamette Valley Pinot Noir, and ended up with a bottle that cost more than I normally spent. That felt right somehow. Bringing something good. I'd spent most of the drive cycling through possibilities. Money was the obvious one. That house in Bellevue couldn't have come cheap, and financial planning income varied wildly depending on your client base. Maybe they were behind on something. Maybe they needed a short-term loan. I'd have given it. That wasn't a question. Or maybe Claire was pregnant. That thought arrived unexpectedly and stayed, warm and persistent, through 3 separate stretches of highway. A grandchild. Something new to organize a life around. Something Margaret would have been extraordinary at. I let myself want it. I had no right to be surprised when I turned onto their street and saw the house. I'd visited twice before, once right after they bought it, once for Thanksgiving 2 years ago. But both times I'd been looking at it through the filter of being glad Daniel was doing well, proud of what he'd built. This time, for reasons I can't entirely explain, I looked at it differently. The Craftsman home had been fully renovated, original character preserved on the outside. The wide front porch, the exposed rafter tails, the deep green paint that suited the neighborhood. But everything behind the facade was new, expensive, deliberate. The landscaping was the kind that required professional maintenance. Not just trimmed, but designed. The sort of landscaping that signals a certain level of income and a certain desire to signal it. In the driveway sat a BMW 5 Series, navy blue, recent model. Beside it, a Tesla Model S in matte gray. 2 cars. Both new, both luxury. I parked my 2012 Camry at the curb and sat for a moment. Daniel had been a financial planner for 8 years. His practice had grown steadily, from what he'd told me, though he told me less and less in recent years, our conversations staying carefully in the shallow end. Financial planning could be lucrative. I knew that. Still, I told myself I was doing the math of a retired teacher who'd spent 31 years watching every dollar, and that I needed to stop doing that math and go knock on the door. I knocked on the door. Claire answered with a hug that felt, I'm going to be honest with you, because this whole story requires honesty. Rehearsed. Not cold, not unwelcoming, just slightly off-tempo, the way a musician plays a piece they've practiced rather than a piece they love. She smelled like expensive perfume and held on exactly 2 seconds longer than felt natural. Robert, so good to see you. She stepped back, smiled. She was lovely, always had been. Dark hair, careful makeup, the kind of put-together that comes from genuine effort. You look great. You too, I said. You look well? She did look well. Glowing, actually. I filed that away again, next to the word grandchild. Daniel appeared behind her, and the first thing I noticed, the thing I noticed before his face, before his smile, was the watch. I'm not a man who pays attention to watches. I wore a Timex for 20 years, replaced it with another Timex, planned to wear Timex until the day I don't need a watch anymore. But I'd taught physics long enough to notice precision instruments, and what was on Daniel's wrist was not a Timex. Round case, elegant dial, the unmistakable restraint of serious money. A Patek Philippe, if I wasn't mistaken. The kind of watch that costs more than most people's cars. Dad, he crossed the hall and hugged me properly. Warm, genuine, the way he'd hugged me since he was small. Whatever else I felt in that moment, the hug was real. Really glad you made it. Let me take your coat. Nice watch, I said. He looked at his wrist as if he'd forgotten it was there. Oh yeah, client gave it to me. Gratitude gift. You know how it is. I didn't, actually, but I nodded. The inside of the house was immaculate in the way that homes in shelter magazines are immaculate, which is to say, not quite the way real homes look when people actually live in them. The hardwood floors had been refinished so recently they still carried that particular sheen. The walls were painted in a fashionable gray that costs $50 a gallon and looks like nothing and everything at once. Abstract artwork on every significant wall, not prints, originals, or at least things in expensive frames. The kind of art that signals sophistication without demanding to be understood. The kitchen, visible through the wide doorway, was a statement. Marble countertops running the full length of the room. A range that belonged in a professional kitchen. A refrigerator with the brand name displayed on the exterior like a badge. I set the Pinot Noir on the counter. Beautiful home, he said. We've put a lot into it. Daniel smiled. Come on, living room. I'll get you something to drink. We've got a really nice scotch, 15-year Glenfiddich. Water's fine. He and Claire exchanged a glance. I'd seen that glance before. The way two people communicate without words when a third person has just said something that slightly disrupts a plan. I filed that away too. The living room had been designed around a fireplace that had probably never actually been used for a fire. Gas insert, immaculate glass, the kind that exists for the look rather than the warmth. On the mantel, a few carefully selected objects, a piece of driftwood that had definitely been purchased at a design store, a ceramic vase in a fashionable earth tone, a small succulent. No photographs. Margaret and I had photographs everywhere, on every horizontal surface, on every wall. Our house looked like a record of a life lived by people who wanted to remember. Daniel's living room looked like the set of a life being performed. I sat on a sofa that was firmer than it looked and told myself to stop being uncharitable. Daniel had built a successful life. Claire had taste. There was nothing wrong with any of this. I told myself that right up until we sat down to dinner. The salmon was exceptional. Cedar planked, maple glaze with a hint of something smoky. Claire had real skill in the kitchen that I'd underestimated. The asparagus was charred just right. There was a Napa Valley Cabernet open on the table that I recognized as costing somewhere north of $80. "How's retirement treating you, Robert?" Claire asked, passing the serving dish. "It's an adjustment. Lot of time to think." "You should travel." Daniel poured more wine for himself. "See the world. Mom would have wanted that for you." The thing about Daniel invoking his mother was that he did it with such ease, such casual confidence, as if her memory was a card he held and could play whenever the conversation needed it. He had no idea what his mother would have wanted. I didn't say that. Maybe someday. We ate quietly for a few minutes, the kind of quiet that has something underneath it. Daniel cleared his throat. He set down his fork with a small precision that I recognized. It was a settling gesture, the way a person arranges themselves before a presentation. "So, Dad, Claire and I wanted to talk to you about something." Here it comes, I thought. "We've been thinking about the future," he said. "Building wealth, protecting what we have, thinking about family legacy." The words came out smooth, professional, the cadence of a prepared pitch. "I've been developing some incredible opportunities through my practice, and we wanted to offer you a chance to be involved before we open it up more broadly." I set down my own fork. "Daniel, if you need money, it's not like that." He shook his head, smiled. That particular smile that says, "I understand why you'd think that, but you're about to be pleasantly corrected." "This is an opportunity, Dad. I've got clients seeing consistent returns of 15, 18% annually. These aren't speculative plays. These are managed low-risk positions." "What kind of positions?" He leaned forward. This was the part he'd rehearsed most carefully, I could tell. There was a different energy in him, something that looked like excitement but had the quality of performance under it. "I work with a nonprofit called the Pacific Northwest Cancer Relief Fund. They connect patients, people with serious diagnoses, to experimental treatments, clinical trials, specialized care abroad. A lot of these treatments aren't covered by insurance. So patients fundraise. GoFundMe, community drives, family campaigns. They raise significant money, sometimes $50,000, $60,000, $80,000, and they put it in the fund while they're coordinating their care. I'm following you. Here's the thing, Dad. That money sits idle. Weeks, sometimes months. While patients wait for treatment scheduling, ethics reviews, international coordination, the funds just sit there, not working for anyone." He spread his hands. "What I do is optimize those funds. Put them into short-term, high-yield instruments while the patients are getting ready. By the time they need the money, the fund has grown. Patients benefit. The fund benefits. Investors benefit." He sat back. "Everyone wins." The room was very quiet. "You're investing other people's medical fundraising money," I said. "Optimizing, Dad. Managing. These aren't my clients' funds. I'm not touching their personal accounts. This is nonprofit fund management. It's completely legitimate." "Do the patients know?" Claire's smile shifted, tightened in a way that had nothing to do with warmth. "They're focused on getting better, Robert. The financial management details aren't really their concern. That's what administrators are for." Something cold moved through me. The feeling wasn't sharp, not yet. It was more like the first moment you realize the temperature has dropped. You don't know yet how cold it will get, but you know something has changed. "I need to use your bathroom," I said. Daniel pointed upstairs without breaking stride, already pivoting back to his pitch. "Second door on the left." Their upstairs bathroom was predictably designed within an inch of its life. Marble floors, marbles countertops, one of those rainfall shower heads that looks like a small weather system. Heated floors. I could feel them through my socks. Towels folded in the style of a hotel that charges $400 a night. I ran cold water over my wrists at the sink the way I'd been doing for 30 years when I needed to think clearly. An old habit, maybe strange, but it worked. The cold water brought me back into my body. I was overreacting. Probably. Daniel was aggressive with money. He'd always been that way, always pushing the edge of what seemed prudent. Maybe this was legal. Maybe it was even common practice in the nonprofit world. I didn't know enough about nonprofit fund management to say. I opened the medicine cabinet, looking for antacids. The cabinet was deeper than expected, a custom built-in that extended back several inches beyond a normal medicine cabinet. 2 shelves of standard items: ibuprofen, cold medicine, dental floss, Claire's skincare products arranged with the same care as the rest of the house. And on the back shelf, half hidden behind a row of Claire's cosmetics, was a manila folder. I should not have reached for it. I knew that even as my hand was already moving. Known knowledge and reflexive action are different things, and my hands are the hands of a man who spent 31 years picking things up and looking at them closely. I took the folder. Inside were printouts, spreadsheets, columns of names I didn't recognize, dollar amounts beside each name, dates. But it was the letterhead at the top of each page that made my vision narrow to a single point. Pacific Northwest Cancer Relief Fund, registered 501 C3, charitable organization. These weren't investment returns. These were disbursements. I didn't understand all of it. Not immediately, not standing in my son's marble bathroom with my hands starting to shake. But I understood enough. The column labeled Treatment Fund Total showed money that had been raised. The column labeled Transfer, Operating Account, showed money that had left. And the operating account number at the top of the transfer column was not the fund's main charitable account. It was a different account number, a private account number. There were 34 names on these spreadsheets. 34 people who had raised money, bake sales and GoFundMe campaigns and church collections and family loans to pay for treatments that might save their lives. And beside each name, in that transfer column, was a number showing how much of that money had quietly moved somewhere else. My hands were shaking badly now. I pulled out my phone. My fingers felt thick and wrong, like they belonged to someone else. I photographed every page. 13 pages, front and back. The amounts ranged from $18,000 to $85,000. 34 names. The math, even done quickly in my head, was staggering. I heard footsteps on the stairs. Light, certain, practiced. "Dad? You okay up there?" I shoved the folder back into the cabinet exactly as I'd found it. Flushed the toilet. Turned on the faucet. Turned it off. Looked at myself in the mirror. The man looking back at me was 63 years old. He had gray at his temples and lines around his eyes, and the look of someone who had just understood something he could not ununderstand. "Fine," I called back. "Just a minute." When I came downstairs, they were both in the kitchen, and they both looked up with the same expression, concern and something else, something that hid behind the concern the way a hand hides behind a back. "You look pale, Robert," Claire said. "I'm feeling a little off, actually." I picked up my coat from the hook by the door. "I think I need to head home." "But we haven't had dessert," Daniel frowned. "And we still need to actually discuss the—" "Email me the details," I said. "I'll think about it." "Dad," his voice shifted, firmer. "This is time sensitive. I need to know if you're in by end of—" "I said I'll think about it, Daniel." My voice came out sharper than I intended. Both of them went still. "I'll be in touch." I took my coat. I walked to the door. I turned back once, I don't know why, some reflex, and looked at Claire. She wasn't watching Daniel. She wasn't watching me leave. She was watching my coat pocket, where I'd put my phone. Her face was composed. Calm. The way faces are calm when they're working very hard at it. I said goodnight. I walked to my car. I sat behind the wheel for 5 minutes without starting the engine, watching the rain move through the glow of the streetlights. Claire hadn't been surprised when I said I needed to leave. She'd looked relieved. Not the relief of someone who's glad an awkward dinner is wrapping up. The relief of someone who has been waiting, tensely, for a particular thing to either happen or not happen, and has just received an ambiguous answer and is calculating what it means. She knows, I thought. I started the car. She doesn't just know about the money. She's part of this. She helps him do it. And tonight, something about the way I came downstairs from that bathroom told her something was wrong. I pulled away from the curb slowly. 3 hours back to Portland. The rain was steady now, the kind that makes the highway lights smear into long orange ribbons. I didn't turn on the radio. I drove in silence with 13 pages of photographs on my phone and the sound of my own breathing. And I thought about 34 people who had raised money in desperation and handed it over in hope. And I thought about Margaret in her hospital bed in those last weeks. And I thought about my son's face when he'd said everyone wins and how he'd believed it. Or maybe he hadn't believed it at all. Maybe that was the thing I was still trying to understand. I didn't sleep that night. Not a single hour. I sat in the armchair by the window, the one Margaret had picked out at an estate sale in 2009, reupholstered twice since then, the one piece of furniture I would never get rid of. And I watched Portland do what Portland does in October. The rain came and went in waves. The street outside my house stayed empty and glistening. A neighbor's porch light stayed on all night for no reason I could identify. I had my phone in my hand. The photos were still there, all 13 pages, slightly blurred at the edges from my shaking hands, but legible. Every time I thought maybe I'd misunderstood something, I opened them again. Every time I thought maybe I was overreacting, I looked at that transfer column and counted the names. 34 names. People who had done what people do when someone they love is dying. They'd asked for help. They'd told their story on the internet, at church, at work, to anyone who would listen. They'd accepted money from neighbors and coworkers and strangers. Money given with love, with the specific intention of buying someone more time. And that money had been taken, quietly, systematically, by a man who understood the mechanics of financial systems well enough to make the taking look like something else. By my son. On the mantel above the fireplace, Margaret smiled at me from our 25th anniversary photograph. Crater Lake in August, both of us slightly sunburned, her hair blown sideways by the wind off the water. She looked the way she always looked in photographs, like she was about to say something true. I talked to her. I know how that sounds. I know a 63-year-old retired physics teacher who talks to a photograph of his dead wife is a particular kind of sad. But I'd been doing it since February 4 years ago, and I had stopped apologizing for it. Margaret, I said, I need you to tell me what to do. The photograph didn't answer. It never does. But I knew what she would have said, because I knew her. 34 years of marriage teaches you a person down to the bone. Margaret Hale had been the most quietly certain person I'd ever met. Not loud about her convictions, never preachy, never performing her ethics for an audience. She simply knew what was right and did it, even when it cost her, and she had no patience for the kind of moral arithmetic where you weigh your own comfort against someone else's suffering and call it complicated. She would have looked at me with those clear brown eyes and said, Robert, you already know. I looked at the shelf beside the fireplace. The photographs there were of Daniel, 8 years old in his Little League uniform, missing his 2 front teeth, grinning like the world was a gift specifically addressed to him. 16, holding the certificate from the state math competition, trying very hard to look like it was no big deal. 28, in his tuxedo at the wedding, crying openly when Claire appeared at the end of the aisle. And I had loved him so much in that moment, had thought, whatever else happens, this boy has a good heart. Where did that boy go? I don't mean that as a rhetorical question. I mean I genuinely sat in that chair until 3 a.m. trying to trace the path from that crying boy at the altar to the man who had sat across from me at dinner and said, "Everyone wins," about a scheme that stole from dying people. I couldn't find the path. Maybe it had been gradual, small compromises accumulating like sediment until the original thing was buried completely. Maybe something had broken in him in a way I'd missed because I wasn't paying close enough attention. Maybe I'd never known him as well as I thought. That last possibility was the one that kept me in the chair until the gray October dawn started to seep through the curtains. At 8 o'clock in the morning, I made a pot of coffee. I drank 1 cup standing at the kitchen counter. Then I sat down at the kitchen table, opened my laptop, and found the FBI's financial crimes tip line. My hands were steady. That surprised me. After the night I'd had, I'd expected my body to feel like what it was, an old man's body that hadn't slept. But there was something on the other side of the long night, some clarity that came from having already made the decision and just needing to execute it. The phone call went through 3 transfers before I reached the right department. Each time I was put on hold, I used the silence to rehearse what I needed to say, stripping away everything that wasn't essential. My son operates as a financial advisor in Seattle. He is affiliated with a nonprofit called the Pacific Northwest Cancer Relief Fund. I have photographic evidence that charitable funds intended for cancer patients are being diverted to private accounts. Clean, factual. Said without breaking. I said it without breaking. The agent who took my initial report was professional and careful and gave nothing away in his voice. He told me someone would be in contact within 48 hours, gave me an email address for secure document transmission, and thanked me for coming forward. I sent the photographs. Then I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, not moving, looking at the place where Margaret used to sit across from me. I hope I'm still me, I thought. I hope this is what still being me looks like. Detective Sarah Novak arrived at my door 2 days later, on a Thursday afternoon, with her partner, Detective James Ortega. She was younger than I'd expected, early 40s, dark hair pulled back, wearing a gray blazer over a blue shirt. She had the kind of eyes that have seen a great deal and processed most of it internally, with very little residue showing on the surface. Tired eyes, but alert ones. Ortega was quieter, broader, with a stillness about him that I came to understand over the following weeks was his professional default. He was the kind of man who made people forget he was in the room, which was probably useful in his line of work. They sat at my kitchen table. I made coffee. It felt necessary. It felt like the right way to begin a conversation that I didn't know how to begin. And I told them everything. From the phone call that Tuesday, the drive to Seattle, the house, the cars, the watch, the dinner, the pitch, the language Daniel had used, the bathroom, the cabinet, the folder. Novak listened without interrupting. She took notes in a small notebook, writing quickly, and when I finished, she looked up and said, "Mr. Hale, thank you for coming forward with this. This took real courage." "It took finding out my son is a thief," I said. She held my gaze for a moment. "Yes," she said, "it took that too." Then she told me what they knew. The Pacific Northwest Cancer Relief Fund had been on the FBI's radar for 14 months. There had been complaints. A family in Tacoma who'd been told funds were temporarily unavailable when their mother's treatment date arrived. A man in Spokane whose wife had died waiting for a disbursement that never came. Individual complaints, each one easy to attribute to administrative delays, bureaucratic slowdowns, the genuine complexity of coordinating international medical care. Nothing that added up to a provable pattern. Not until now. "Total suspected diversion," Novak said, looking at her notes, "is in excess of $1 million. I heard the number. I understood the number. My mind accepted it the way the body accepts a significant physical blow, with a brief, stunned pause before the full weight arrives. Some of these patients have died, Mr. Hale." Her voice was careful, but not soft. She wasn't protecting me from the information. She was giving it to me straight because she'd assessed me as someone who needed to hear it straight. "We have 3 confirmed cases where the patient passed away before treatment could be rescheduled. Their families are still carrying debt they took on to raise those funds." Margaret's face in the February light. The way she'd looked in those last weeks, trying to stay present for me even when the pain made presence almost impossible. "If someone had done this to us, what do you need me to do?" I asked. "They needed me to wear a wire." Novak explained it at the same kitchen table on her second visit, 6 days after the first. She was direct about what it would require and what it would cost. They had the photographs, which established the existence of the records, and placed them in Daniel's home. What they needed was Daniel's own voice explaining the system, confirming his role, describing where the money went. Without that, a competent defense attorney could create enough reasonable doubt to walk him out of a courtroom. "I understand this is your son," she said. It wasn't an apology. It was an acknowledgement. "He is," I said. "He's also diverted over $1 million from people with cancer." "I know what he is," I said it quietly. "I just need a minute to get used to having to be the one who does something about it." She gave me the minute. She was good at that. Novak understood when silence was more useful than words. "What if he realizes?" I asked. "We'll be in a vehicle outside. You'll have a panic word if you feel unsafe." "I'm not worried about my safety." I looked at my hands on the table. "I'm worried about looking my son in the face and lying to him, even knowing what he's done." Ortega, who had been quiet through most of both meetings, spoke for the first time. "Mr. Hale," he said, "I've done this work for 16 years. I've sat across from a lot of people who had to make this kind of decision. What I can tell you is this. The people who regret it are almost always the ones who didn't act, not the ones who did." I looked at him. He meant it. There was nothing performative about it. "All right," I said. "Tell me how it works." They fitted me with the device on a Tuesday morning in a parking garage in downtown Portland, in the back of an unmarked Ford that smelled like stale coffee and the particular institutional cleanliness of government vehicles. The device was smaller than I'd imagined, about the size of a box of matches, connected to a wire thinner than a shoelace. The technician, a young woman named Priya, who approached the whole process with the focused cheerfulness of someone doing a job they're genuinely good at, applied it to my chest with medical adhesive. "Right side," she said. "Less movement from breathing. You'll barely feel it once we get your shirt on." She wasn't wrong about the feeling, but I was acutely aware of its presence in a way that had nothing to do with physical sensation. It sat against my chest like a small, precise fact, a recording of everything that was about to happen before it happened. Novak went over the approach one final time. Keep it conversational. Let Daniel lead. Don't push too directly too early. Let him feel like he's winning me over. The goal was for him to explain the system in his own words. Where the money went, how the transfers were structured. What happened to funds when a patient died? "If he asks why you're suddenly interested again," she said, "you tell him you've been thinking about it. The returns he mentioned are attractive. You're a retired teacher on a fixed income and you want your money to work harder." "That last part is true," I said. Novak almost smiled. "True things are easier to hold on to under pressure." I called Daniel from the passenger seat of my own car, parked outside my house, while Novak and Ortega sat in the Ford 2 blocks away. My voice came out more natural than I'd expected. Some part of me, apparently, was capable of this. "Dad?" He sounded pleased, and underneath the pleasure was relief, which told me he'd been worried. "Changed your mind about the investment?" "I've been thinking about what you said," I told him. "I'd like to hear more. Maybe over lunch?" "Absolutely." The relief was audible now. "I know just the place." He chose a seafood restaurant in South Lake Union, the kind of Seattle restaurant where the bill for 2 people could feed a family of 4 for a week. He'd reserved a corner table, set back from the main dining room, partially screened by a partition of frosted glass. He's used to having private conversations, I noticed. He knows which tables to request. Daniel was already seated when I arrived, already had a glass of sparkling water in front of him, already projecting the warm, forward energy of a man about to close a deal. He stood to hug me, ordered the halibut for both of us without asking. "So," he said, settling back with a smile, "tell me what's been going through your head." I asked him questions. Careful ones, the kind that sounded like the questions of a cautious investor rather than a father trying to document a crime. How were the short-term instruments selected? What was the average holding period? What safeguards existed if a patient needed funds faster than anticipated? He answered smoothly, fluently, with the confidence of a man who had given this explanation many times and had long since stopped worrying about it. "The beauty of the fund structure," he said, leaning forward slightly, lowering his voice with the practiced habit of seeming exclusive, "is that treatment timelines are inherently unpredictable. Ethics reviews, international treatment protocols, patient health fluctuations, there are so many legitimate reasons for delays. That window is where the opportunity lives. And if a patient dies before treatment?" The words came out steady. I don't know how. Something crossed his face. Not guilt, not discomfort. Something more like the brief flicker of a person recalculating a math problem they've already solved. "That's actually one of the more elegant aspects," he said. "Unused funds legally revert to the foundation, to the operating account specifically." He paused. "Which I manage." "The money goes to you." "I manage it, Dad. I provide infrastructure, coordination, financial oversight. That requires compensation." He sat back. "You don't understand how expensive it is to live in Seattle. The house, Claire's." He stopped. Started again. "I provide real value. The fund couldn't operate without the financial management I provide. If I'm compensated for that through fund appreciation, what exactly is the harm?" "The harm," I said very quietly, "is that 34 people raised that money to stay alive, Daniel." He looked at me. The restaurant noise continued around us, the soft percussion of silverware, the murmur of other conversations, a burst of laughter from somewhere near the bar. The ordinary world, continuing. His eyes moved to my chest. Not dramatically, just a single, quick, professional assessment. The kind of glance that belongs to someone who has spent years reading rooms and people and the small signals that things are not what they seem. "Dad." "Yes." A pause. 4 seconds. 5. "Are you wearing a wire?" The question landed in the space between us like something dropped from a great height. My silence answered it. The change that moved through him was not what I expected. I think I'd been bracing for anger, for the version of Daniel I'd occasionally seen in his teenage years, the raised voice, the chair pushed back. What I got instead was something colder and more final. His face went through several things in rapid succession: shock, calculation, a flash of something that might have been grief if it had been allowed to stay longer. And then it settled into a stillness that I had never seen on my son's face before. A stillness that had nothing soft in it. He stood up slowly. "My own father," he said. His voice was very quiet, controlled. The control of someone holding something back that they have decided not to release in public. Wearing a wire. "Daniel, you want to destroy what's left of this family." He was looking at me with an expression I had no reference point for. I had never seen this man before, this particular configuration of my son's face. "Over people who were going to die anyway." He picked up his napkin from his lap and placed it on the table with a deliberateness that was more disturbing than any gesture of rage would have been. "I will never forgive this," he said. "I want you to know that. Whatever happens next, I will never forgive you for this." He walked out, not fast, not dramatically, with the measured pace of a man who has decided something, heading for the door with the certainty of someone who has already imagined this moment and knows exactly how to move through it. I sat alone at the corner table with 2 plates of halibut and the specific silence of a man who has just done something irreversible. My phone buzzed. A text from a number I didn't have saved. Novak's secondary line. "We got what we need. Sit tight." She called me 40 minutes later as I sat in my car in the restaurant parking garage, unable to make myself drive yet. "Teams moved on his office at 2:15, she said. "He was taken into custody without incident." "Claire has been brought in for questioning," Novak continued. "She'll likely be released. We're still assessing what we can establish about her direct involvement." "What did he say?" I didn't know why I asked. Maybe I was hoping for something, some indication that when the moment came, something in him had recognized what he'd done. "When they arrested him, did he say anything?" Novak was quiet for just a beat too long. "He said one thing to the arresting agent." "What was it?" Another pause. She decided to tell me. "He said my father set me up. Not, 'There's been a mistake.' Not, 'I want my attorney.' Not even anger exactly. Just that sentence. A sentence that placed the responsibility for what was happening entirely outside himself. A sentence that told me, more clearly than anything that had come before, that the man who had sat across from me at that restaurant table, explaining the elegant aspects of stealing from dying people, had believed, up until the moment the FBI walked into his office, that I would never actually do anything about it. My father set me up. He hadn't said, "My father turned me in." He hadn't said, "My father reported what I did." He'd said, "set me up," as if my action were the crime, as if the thing being done to him were the betrayal, rather than the thing he'd done to 34 people. I sat in the parking garage for a long time. The concrete was damp. Someone's car alarm went off and then stopped. Seattle went about its business 6 floors above me. I looked at my phone. I found the last email Daniel had sent me, 4 months ago, a brief exchange about Thanksgiving plans that had never materialized. I looked at the photograph I kept as my phone wallpaper, the one I'd kept there for 4 years and had never been able to change. Margaret at Crater Lake, laughing at something just outside the frame. "Promise me you'll still be you, Robert." "I'm still me, Margaret," I said out loud in the empty car in the parking garage. "I think I'm still me." Then I started the car. 2 weeks later, I sat in a federal courtroom in Seattle and watched my son, in a suit and tie, his Patek Philippe gone, his easy confidence still technically present but beginning to show its underlining, plead not guilty to 34 counts of wire fraud and theft from a charitable organization. His attorney, a careful man named Alan Frost, who carried a briefcase that probably cost more than my first car, argued that Daniel had always intended to restore the funds, that the transfers represented aggressive but legitimate fund management, that the word theft was a prosecutorial overreach. Patricia Lawson, the assistant U.S. attorney assigned to the case, listened to this argument with the expression of a woman who has heard a great deal of creative accounting in her career and is entirely prepared for this particular variety of it. Outside in the corridor afterward, I stood by a window and watched the Seattle rain come down on the courthouse steps, and Novak appeared beside me with 2 cups of terrible vending machine coffee and handed me one without asking. "Frost will push for a deal," she said. "Lawson won't take it, not with 34 counts. How long?" "Trial will take 3 to 4 weeks, probably. Several more months before sentencing." She looked at me sideways. "Are you doing okay, Mr. Hale?" I considered the question honestly. "I think okay is probably the wrong word for what I am right now," I said. "But I'm here. I'm doing what needs to be done." I looked at the rain on the courthouse steps. "That has to count for something." "It does," she said simply. We drank the terrible coffee and watched the rain, and I thought about 34 names on a spreadsheet in a marble bathroom, and I thought about what it was going to take to get from this corridor to the end of this, and I decided that what it was going to take was exactly what I'd always had: the willingness to stay in the room when the room is hard. Margaret had taught me that. I was going to need it. The trial began on a Monday in late January in a federal courtroom on the 5th floor of the William Kenzo Nakamura United States Courthouse in Seattle. I know the building's full name because I stood outside it on the first morning and read it off the facade, partly because I needed something concrete to focus on, and partly because I'd spent 31 years teaching teenagers that the names we give to public buildings are a kind of promise, a statement about what we intend to do inside them. William Kenzo Nakamura was a Medal of Honor recipient, a Japanese-American soldier who fought for a country that had imprisoned his family, a man who had decided that what America was supposed to be mattered more than what America had done to him. I thought about that a lot, standing on those courthouse steps in the January cold. Patricia Lawson had told me the trial would take 3 to 4 weeks. It took 4 weeks and 2 days. I attended every session. I don't know exactly why I felt compelled to be present for all of it. It wasn't required of me, and more than one person suggested that I didn't need to put myself through it. But I had started something, and I needed to see it through to the end. Not for punishment's sake, not for any reason I could have articulated cleanly at the time. It simply felt like the minimum required to honor the weight of what had happened. Alan Frost was a skilled attorney. I want to say that clearly because fairness matters, and Frost did his job with intelligence and precision. His argument, constructed carefully over the first week of trial, was built on 3 pillars. First, that Daniel had genuinely intended the fund transfers to be temporary, that his investment strategy had been designed to return profits to patients, that the scheme was aggressive fund management rather than criminal theft. Second, that the Pacific Northwest Cancer Relief Fund's governance structure was so poorly designed that no single individual could be held fully responsible for what had gone wrong. Third, and most delicately, that the patients themselves had benefited, in some cases, from treatment coordination that Daniel's involvement had facilitated, and that the harm, while real, was not the product of malicious intent. It was a coherent argument. It was, I think, the best argument available given the facts. Patricia Lawson took it apart methodically, without drama, piece by piece. She brought in a forensic accountant who spent 2 full days on the stand walking the jury through the financial records. The numbered account that received the transferred funds, the pattern of transfers, always within days of a patient's fundraising campaign reaching its goal, always before the treatment coordination had been completed. The withdrawals from that account, mortgage payments on the Bellevue house, car payments, hotel charges from a trip to Tuscany, restaurant bills, clothing purchases, the Patek Philippe watch. The jury watched with the focused attention of people who have committed to understanding something complex and are determined to get there. Then Lawson brought in the patients and their families. A family from Tacoma named Torres, Eduardo and his daughter Rosa, who had sold Eduardo's pickup truck, his only work vehicle, to contribute to his wife Maria's cancer fund. $22,000 raised over 4 months. Maria Torres had received a treatment date at a clinic in Houston. When the date arrived, the fund told them the money was temporarily unavailable. Please reschedule. By the time the fund had another available date, Maria's condition had progressed beyond what the treatment could address. Eduardo Torres took the stand and described selling his truck in the flat, careful voice of a man who has told this story enough times that he has learned to tell it without breaking. He was a compact man in his 60s, wearing a suit that was slightly too large for him. The suit of a man who doesn't wear suits often and owns one for occasions like funerals and courtrooms. A couple named James and Patricia Okafor from Bellevue, who had remortgaged their home to contribute to James's leukemia treatment fund. $67,000. The treatment had been scheduled at a facility in Germany. The fund's money was unavailable. The rescheduled date never arrived. James Okafor was still alive. He'd found alternative treatment financing through a hospital program, but he and Patricia were carrying a second mortgage on a house they'd paid off the year before and would be for the next 11 years. Patricia Okafor cried on the stand, not dramatically, but in the quiet, involuntary way of someone who has held something together for a long time and is in a room where holding it together is no longer required. 19 witnesses in total over 8 days. And then the last one. I had met Eleanor Briggs once before the trial, at a meeting Lawson had arranged with several of the victims in November. She'd arrived by bus. I'd seen her getting off at the corner through the window of the office building where we met, in a navy blue coat that was clean and well-maintained and showed at the elbows the gentle wear of a garment that had been worn with care for many years. She was 71. She had the posture of a woman who had made a decision at some point in her life to stand straight and had not revisited it. White hair, reading glasses on a chain around her neck, the specific kind of stillness that belongs to people who have suffered significantly and come through it without becoming bitter, which is the hardest kind of coming through. Her husband Harold had been a 4th-grade teacher in a small town east of Seattle, near the Cascades. 46 years in the same classroom, more or less. He'd coached Little League. He'd run the church's food drive for 23 years. He was, by every account I had heard, and every instinct I had developed over 3 decades of teaching, exactly the kind of person that schools and communities and the quiet fabric of ordinary American life depend on and rarely properly acknowledge. Harold Briggs had been diagnosed with liver cancer in March. The community where he and Eleanor lived had responded the way that small communities sometimes still respond to one of their own in need, with an outpouring that was, by any measure, remarkable. Bake sales and car washes and church collections and a GoFundMe that spread through 3 counties. Teachers, former students, neighbors, the parents of children Harold had coached 20 years ago. $54,000, raised in 11 weeks. The experimental immunotherapy treatment had been scheduled at a clinic in Tijuana. The appointment was confirmed. Eleanor had packed Harold's bag. She had arranged for her sister to watch the house. She had, in the particular way of a woman who has been organized her whole life, prepared for every contingency she could think of. The fund called 2 days before the appointment. The money was temporarily unavailable. Please reschedule. Harold Briggs died 7 weeks later. The $54,000 never became available. When I met Eleanor in November, she had taken my hand in both of hers and looked at me for a long moment before saying anything. "I know what this cost you," she said. "I'm sorry about Harold," I said. "He was a good man who deserved better than what happened to him." She said it simply, without performance. "You did right by his memory, Mr. Hale. That matters." I had not expected to cry. I had believed by November that I had largely exhausted my capacity for unexpected crying. I was wrong about that. I excused myself for a moment, stood in a hallway, and pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes until the feeling passed. I thought about Margaret, about the specific desperation of loving someone who is sick and being willing to do absolutely anything, sell anything, borrow anything, sacrifice anything, to buy them more time. I thought about what it would have meant, in those 7 months, to have that money taken, to have the hope that money represented stolen. Eleanor found me in the hallway. She put her hand on my arm. "It's all right," she said. "You're allowed." She was comforting me. The woman whose husband had died waiting for treatment that never came was comforting me. The grace of that has never left me. Eleanor Briggs took the witness stand on the 19th day of trial. She walked to the stand without hurrying, settled herself with a small adjustment to her coat, and looked at the courtroom with the clear-eyed steadiness of someone who has nothing left to be afraid of. She'd already lost the thing she most feared losing. Lawson led her through the story with the care of someone who respects both the story and the person telling it. Eleanor's voice was measured and even throughout, the voice of a woman who had attended 46 years of school board meetings and community gatherings and had learned long ago how to speak clearly in front of a room. She described Harold, not just the illness, Harold himself, the person. The 4th-grade teacher who kept a jar of candy on his desk for students who answered hard questions, who still received Christmas cards from students who were now in their 50s, who had coached Little League for 16 years with the stated philosophy that the score was the least important thing that happened at a game. She described the fundraising, the way the community had shown up, former students in their 40s making donations, the fire station hosting a pancake breakfast, the elementary school's PTA organizing a silent auction, children selling lemonade at the end of the driveway on a cold Saturday morning because they wanted to help Mr. Briggs. People gave with love, she said. Every single one of them. They wanted Harold to live. They believed their money would help him live. She paused and looked at her hands for a moment. I had packed his bag, she said. I want the court to understand that. I had packed Harold's bag for the trip. I had made a typed list of his medications. I had arranged for my neighbor to collect the mail. I had printed the directions from the hotel to the clinic. I believed we were going. The courtroom had the particular quality of silence that only exists when everyone in a room has stopped breathing at the same moment. Then the phone call came. She let that sit for 3 full seconds. I want to say something to Mr. Hale. She turned and she looked directly at Daniel, who was sitting at the defense table with his eyes on the surface in front of him. Mr. Hale, do you know what the worst part is? It isn't that Harold died. Harold got cancer. That wasn't your doing. People get cancer. People die. I have made my peace with that, as much as a person can. Her voice carried no trembling, no rage, just the weight of absolute truth. The worst part is that I had to call back the people who gave us that money and tell them it was gone. I had to look my neighbors in the face, people who'd skipped their own family vacations, who'd taken money from their children's savings, who'd stood in the cold selling hot dogs to raise $25, and tell them that their love had been stolen. Daniel did not look up. That's what you took, Eleanor Briggs said. You didn't just take money. You took what people gave with love, and you turned it into nothing. The silence in the courtroom lasted 5 full seconds after she finished. I counted them. Then Lawson said quietly, No further questions, Your Honor. Frost stood, looked at Eleanor, looked at his notes, looked at his client, who was still studying the table in front of him. No cross-examination, Your Honor. There was nothing to cross-examine. There was no version of that testimony that could be usefully challenged. I sat in the 3rd row from the back and looked at my son. He was 40 years old. He was wearing the same suit he'd worn for most of the trial, a navy blue that had been expensive when he bought it and now seemed to belong to a different life. He was looking at the table. I thought about the boy who'd cried at his own wedding, the boy who'd held his mother's hand in the hospital and whispered things to her that I'd never asked him about, because some things belong only to the 2 people in the room. The boy who'd once, at 11 years old, found a dog on the side of the road and spent 3 weeks finding it a family because he couldn't stand the idea of it being alone. That boy was in there somewhere. He had to be. I didn't know how to reconcile his presence with everything else, but I couldn't make myself stop believing he was in there. Maybe that was just what it meant to be a parent. The jury took 9 hours over 2 days. They came back on a Thursday afternoon with the particular facial expressions of people who have looked at something difficult long and hard and arrived at a conclusion they believe in. The foreperson, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses and a measured delivery, read the verdict on each count in a voice that didn't waver. Guilty, guilty, guilty. 34 counts, 34 times. Daniel received each verdict with his eyes forward and his hands flat on the table. He didn't move. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at anyone in the gallery. The judge scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks out. I drove back to Portland in the dark, through the rain, and for the first time since this had all begun, I felt something release in my chest. Not relief exactly, not happiness, but the particular exhaustion that comes when you've been bracing against something for a long time and can finally, cautiously, stop. 6 weeks later, on a Thursday morning in early April, I put on the suit I'd worn to Margaret's funeral and drove back to Seattle. Before the victim statements began, Patricia Lawson read aloud from her sentencing memorandum. She was presenting something recovered by digital forensics, and she wanted it entered into the record. It was a text exchange between Daniel and Claire, time-stamped at 10:47 p.m. on the night of the dinner in Bellevue, 2.5 hours after I had left their house and driven back to Portland in the rain. Claire had written, "Your dad found the folder. I could tell. He went pale when he came downstairs. We need to move everything tonight." Daniel had replied, "You're being paranoid. He didn't see anything." Claire, "Daniel, move. Everything. Tonight." Daniel, Dad would never report his own son. Stop worrying. I sat in the courtroom and listened to Lawson read those words, and I understood, with the particular clarity of a thing finally named, the full shape of what had happened. Claire had known from the moment I came downstairs from that bathroom. She had seen it in my face before I'd even understood it myself. She had tried to warn him, and he had not listened, because he had been absolutely certain, so certain he didn't even examine the certainty, that I would not do what I did. Daniel hadn't been caught because the FBI was clever, or because the evidence was overwhelming. He had been caught because he had made a catastrophic miscalculation about his own father. He thought my love for him meant I would protect him from consequences. He had never understood that love, real love, sometimes means doing the hardest thing in the room. 19 people spoke before I did. Eduardo Torres, in his too large suit. Patricia Okafor, who this time did not cry, who delivered her statement with a steadiness that was its own kind of testimony. A man named Ray Whitfield, whose wife had died before the rescheduled treatment could happen, who spoke for 4 minutes in a voice so quiet that the court reporter twice asked him to speak up. Former students of Harold Briggs, adults now in their 30s and 40s, who came not because they'd been asked to, but because they wanted to be in the room, because Harold had mattered to them in the way that certain teachers matter, and they needed to be somewhere that acknowledged what had been done. Eleanor Briggs spoke last, briefly, in a voice like a bell struck clean. Harold deserved better. These families deserved better. Justice is late, but it's here. I'm grateful. Then Judge Howard Whitfield, a tall man in his late 60s with silver hair and the bearing of someone who has weighed difficult things for a long time and made peace with the weight, looked up from his notes and asked if any additional parties wished to make a statement. I stood up. I had written and rewritten what I wanted to say 17 times over the preceding 6 weeks. In the end, I put the papers away the night before and decided to just speak. I stood up in that courtroom in my funeral suit, and I looked at my son, who was sitting 15 feet away from me, with his hands folded in front of him. He didn't look at me. "Your Honor," I said. "That's my son. I raised him. I taught high school physics for 31 years. I knew that what you teach and what a person becomes aren't always the same thing." My voice held. I had not been sure it would. When my wife was dying of pancreatic cancer, we used everything we had trying to save her. We liquidated our retirement savings. We borrowed money from her sister. We sold things that mattered to us. We would have sold the house. We would have sold anything. Not because we thought it would definitely work, but because the love you have for someone doesn't let you do the math, it just makes you fight. I paused. So when I found out that my son had been taking the money that people in that exact situation had raised, people who loved someone so much they couldn't do the math either, my voice broke on the next words, and I let it. I understood with a clarity I've rarely experienced what I had to do. I looked at Daniel one more time. He was still looking at the table. "Those 34 people raised their money with love," I said. "They deserved someone to act with the same conviction. That's all I did. That's all I had to offer." I sat down. Eleanor Briggs, 3 rows ahead of me in the gallery, turned and looked at me over her shoulder. She didn't say anything. She nodded once, slowly, with the fullness of a person putting their full weight behind a gesture. That was enough. That was more than enough. Judge Whitfield sentenced Daniel to 9 years in federal prison, full restitution of $1.17 million, plus interest, forfeiture of the Bellevue house, both vehicles, and all identified luxury assets, including the Patek Philippe watch and Claire's jewelry. He read the sentence in the measured cadence of a man who had considered it carefully and was at peace with the conclusion. He noted the scope of the harm, the deliberateness of the scheme, and the particular cruelty of targeting charitable funds raised by desperate families. He noted in a single sentence that the defendant showed no remorse. The guards moved toward Daniel. And then, in the moment when the handcuffs came out, when the formal physical reality of what was happening became impossible to abstract or defer, Daniel looked up. He found me in the gallery. I had been watching his face all morning, waiting without letting myself acknowledge that I was waiting. When his eyes finally moved across the room and found mine, I understood in an instant that this was the last real communication we would have for a very long time, possibly ever. And I tried to read it with the same attention I had given him his whole life. It was not the hatred I had seen at the restaurant, that cold, controlled fury of a man who had been caught and was assigning blame. This was something else, more complicated, more private. What I read in my son's eyes in that moment, and what I have turned over in my mind in the months since, was this: I never believed you would actually do it. Not, I didn't know what I was doing was wrong. Not, I'm sorry. Just that single, final, foundational miscalculation, the assumption, held so deeply it had never even been examined, that his father's love for him was a variable he could factor into his risk assessment, that I would see and know and ultimately choose him over everything else. He had been wrong about that. I think in the end that was the thing that broke him. Not the prison sentence, not the public humiliation, not the loss of the house and the cars and the watch. The thing that broke Daniel Hale was finding out that his father's love was real enough to hold him accountable. The guards let him out. I sat in the empty courtroom for a long time after the gallery had cleared, and Novak came and sat beside me. And she didn't say anything, and I didn't say anything. And that was exactly right. 18 months have passed since the sentencing. I am 64 years old. I live alone in the house on the east side of Portland that Margaret and I bought in 1991, the year Daniel started kindergarten. The rhododendron in the front yard that Margaret planted needs trimming. I keep meaning to get to it. Daniel has refused every visit request. His lawyer sends periodic updates about the legal proceedings. All appeals have been denied. Claire disappeared from her social media accounts within a month of the sentencing. I don't know where she is. I don't look. Last month I received a letter in the mail, handwritten on plain white stationery, postmarked from a small town in eastern Washington. Dear Mr. Hale, I don't write letters often anymore. Harold always said I should write more, that I had things worth saying. I suppose he was right, as he usually was. I wanted you to know that the community here had a memorial for Harold last month, his birthday. Former students came from 4 states. The Little League field where he coached for 16 years is being named after him. It took some time, but it's happening. I also wanted to say what I perhaps didn't say clearly enough when we met. Harold was a good man who deserved better than what happened to him. You knew that without knowing him. You acted on it when you didn't have to. I am grateful every day that you did. Some people would have looked the other way. I understand why they would. I don't judge them. But you didn't look away. And because of that, whatever measure of justice exists in this world was applied to what happened to us. That matters. It mattered to Harold's memory. It matters to me. With gratitude, Eleanor Briggs, I read the letter at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. I read it twice. Then I folded it carefully and put it in the drawer where I keep Margaret's letters. The ones she wrote me over the years, on birthdays and anniversaries and ordinary Tuesdays when she had something she wanted to say, and writing was how she said it. I put Eleanor's letter with Margaret's letters because it belonged there, because both women had taught me something about what it means to keep your heart open in the face of loss, about the particular courage of continuing to love the world after the world has given you every reason not to. I cried reading Eleanor's letter, not the desperate, gasping grief of the early months after Margaret died, or the cold, dry grief of sitting in a courtroom watching your child be sentenced to federal prison. Something different, something that felt, if I am being fully honest, almost like grace. People ask me if I regret it. I understand why they ask. It is the natural question, the human question. Was it worth it? Knowing what it cost you? I tell them the truth. I lost my son the day he decided that a dying person's money was his to take. I didn't lose him when I made the phone call. He was already gone. All I did was make sure he didn't hurt anyone else. That's not nobility. That's just the minimum. Margaret used to tell me that the person you are in the hardest moment of your life is the truest version of yourself. That the ordinary days are practice, and the hard days are the test, and the only thing you can control is whether you show up to the test as the person you've been practicing to be. I showed up. I don't say that with pride. Pride would be the wrong word. I say it with the quiet acknowledgement of a man who was asked to do an extremely difficult thing and found that he was able to do it, and is still in the process of understanding what that means. I am 64 years old. I live alone. My son is in federal prison. The rhododendron needs trimming. Most mornings I make 2 cups of coffee before I remember. Then I drink them both. But I sleep at night. I sleep without the weight that comes from having seen something wrong and looked away. I sleep in the house Margaret and I made together, with her photograph on the mantel and her letters in the drawer and the knowledge. Not comfortable knowledge, not easy knowledge, but solid bedrock knowledge, that when everything was on the line, I was still the man she believed I was. That has to be enough. For anyone reading this who is facing something like what I faced, who has seen something wrong being done by someone they love, and is sitting in the dark asking themselves if they can bear the cost of doing right, I want to say this. I know the cost. I've paid it. I would pay it again. Not because it doesn't hurt. It hurts every single day. But because the alternative, carrying the knowledge of what I knew and doing nothing, would have been a different kind of loss. The loss of something I couldn't name until I almost risked losing it. There are 34 families who got some measure of justice because one father made a hard call. Eleanor Briggs got to put Harold's name on a Little League field. Patricia Okafor's mortgage will be paid off in 11 years instead of 30. I lost my son, but I kept myself. That's worth knowing, even when the knowing costs you everything. I'd make the same call again.